Wave. There she is. All right, let's not overdo it. Okay. Yeah, very nice. Yes, thank you. Now I have to do things.
Get track on your back. Thank you.
Okie doke. And there we are. The little sprite, the mystery fairy there that you saw has now fled the office and up to the upstairs. I'm sure she's still lurking around within hearing range somewhere. Anyway, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Good stuff. Hi, I'm Tad. I'm going to be reading, and as I mentioned last night or this morning, depending on how you parse these things, I have our good news, our family good news is that we are all vaccinated, and we have now moved past the expiry date, in which point you know if you are going to have going to be safe, or presumably safe. So that's where we're at. We've all had our vaccinations, and we've all gone the 2 weeks or whatever it is afterward, and so we're actually beginning to reluctantly, carefully emerge from our chrysalis. Sadly, we have not become beautiful winged creatures, except for my wife. But we are, in fact, still here, which is the main thing and the good thing. And now we are vaccinated as well. So that's the only real news on this front at the moment. Other than that, just glad to be here. Happy to be back with you after missing last week. For those of you who didn't bother to find out why, and I certainly don't blame you if you didn't, that I wasn't on doing my normal reading last week. It was because we had a large power outage. Apparently, as best we can tell, it was remarkably undercovered, considering it was out for most of 24 hours. Somebody ran their car into a pole and knocked it over, and I hope they're okay. I think they eventually rolled down the hill themselves, but I haven't heard anything else about it, so I'm assuming everybody survived and had their seatbelts on. So we lost our power and our water for most of last weekend, which makes things difficult. And but it especially makes things difficult because where we live, there is literally no other way to access the outside world by electronic devices, because we can't get cell coverage where we live. So I couldn't even just post something on Facebook. I actually, that night, I had to drive about 15 miles through the hills because they had closed our road off. Also, I had to drive like 15 miles through the hills to finally get a signal, and thereby hangs a long and boring tale with which I will not bore you. Lucky you. Anyway, so I'm here, we're here, you're here, everybody's here, and that's what's going to happen. I'm going to read some more Shadowmarch. So who have I got that's lined up already? Timothy. Hello, Timothy. Jerry, good to see you as always, Mr. Unangst. You next. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, you've told me, so if I've forgotten, it's just because my brain is tiny, tiny, tiny. I have tiny brain syndrome. Kelly, hi, Kelly. Oh, you weren't even saying hello to me. Kelly was saying hi to Deborah. Well, fine. Anyway, well, I'll say hello to you anyway, just to shame you. Hi, Jared. How are you? And Greg, good evening. Nancy, hello. Good to see you. Emily. Yes, Deborah. Yes, there she was. Nice moves indeed. Sean, Heidi ho. Heidi ho indeed. Kenneth, I already said hello to you, didn't I? No, I didn't. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. I can't tell anymore. Oh, no, I said I've got a Kelly Kenrick and a Kenneth Kelly, and I'm easily confused, as I think I just mentioned. So hello to you also, and also hello to Kelly. Medardo, hello. And, oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, the new book announcement. Well, it's not actually a new book. It's just me not being able to get my entire story into one single volume. But that's all right. I've learned to live with the shame. It's the price that I pay. It's the cross that I bear. It's the pink man's burden. So anyway, Mahmoud, hello. Good to see you too. Jeremy, yes, that was her. Mark, hi, Mark. Thank you. Very kind. Yes, this is one of my favorite shirts. It was given to me by my son. Oh, yeah, that was the other thing last night, which is my son showed up in the middle of the reading last night because I guess he'd been outside talking to somebody on the phone and lost coverage and immediately assumed that I was sitting here continuing to read without being aware that that we'd lost our router or something. And of course I hadn't, but I double checked. But anyway, so I'm still a little grumpy about that. Anyway, Stuart, hi, how are you? What's on the menu for tonight? Well, we'll find out, but I think it's Yasama's and then Quinniton. Becca, hello, Becca. Barban, hello, good to see you too. Melissa, good evening. Claudia, good evening. Gabe, hello. Leah, hello. Justin, thank you, very kind. I don't know if I would call myself a genius, except that I am certainly long-winded. I am long-winded in a creative sort of way. So that's something. James, good to see you. Oh, and Mahmoud, you're vaccinated, suffering from clucking like a chicken now and then, but that's nothing new. I'm so glad to hear that that's nothing new. And I strongly suggest you stay away from the local KFC. Cliff, hi, Cliff. Good to see you. Chris, hello. Oh, it's Chris from New Zealand. Are you still in New Zealand? I assume you're still in New Zealand. Anyway, thank you, Chris. Lovely to see you. And yes, I'm glad the power is back too. Yeah, it is you next. I thought so, Jerry. I knew you'd told me once that it was. And then, as I'm sitting here looking at names going past, I get easily confused. Justin. Hello, Justin. Good to see you. And good. Okay, Kristen. Nice to see you too. So, here we are. Here we sit. And together we will go forward into the future, one moment at a time. And that's how it always works. So, without further ado, by the way, you folks may not know this, but you guys know the quality of mercy speech from Hamlet. The quality of mercy is not strained. Something melts, thaws, and resolves itself into a dew. Very famous line, but one of the things that people don't know is that is probably a pun that Shakespeare is making there at the end, where he says, because he's among other things, Hamlet is considering killing himself. I believe it's from Hamlet. And so he says the quality of mercy is not strained. It melts, thaws, and resolves itself into a dew, D-E-W. But of course, a dew, or a dew, is also adieu, which is French for to or with God, but it means goodbye. So it's a nice little Shakespearean pun. My English teacher back in high school, Jack Phillips, taught me that. One of the many things, including a lot of my love of Shakespeare that I give him credit for. And I finally did one day get to sign him a copy of Caliban's Hour, which was the closest into Shakespeareana that I have arranged. Anyway, so the only thing you need to know from what I was reading last night or early this morning is that Raymond Beck, the young merchant whose caravan was attacked by something out of the shadow line, and when he came back to consciousness, realized everybody was gone, including all the horses and everything, and a young woman who was on her way to become a bride, a young noblewoman. Everybody was gone but him. So he finally showed up at Southmarch during Bryony and Berwick's first meeting of the council as the regent prince and princess. And Bryony has sent Vanson, Ferris Vanson, her captain of the guards, off to go find out what this is, in a very tense scene because, of course, she blames him in large part, for her brother's death, Kendrick's death. Anyway, so that section had just ended. And now we start a new section, still part of the same chapter. The one known as the Scourge of the Shivering Plain rode down out of Shehen on her great black horse, letting the animal pick its way along the narrow hill paths with scarcely a tug on the rein, although in places the drop was so great that it was hard even to see the birds flying below her. Yasamez had no need for haste. Her thoughts were traveling before her, winged messengers faster than any bird, swifter even than the wind. She descended from the heights and turned toward the oldest lands and the greatest city of all, which stood on the shores of the Black Ocean just outside the great northern circle of frost and ice. There were Quar folk that lived even in the northernmost lands beyond Quolnaquar, strange ones who walked in that permanent darkness and made songs with their fingers and their chill skin. But they had lived apart for so long that most of them had little to do with the rest of their race anymore. They scarcely even thought about the lost southern lands, for they had never lived there. And thus, of all the Twilight people, they had suffered the least at the hands of the mortal enemy. These cold ones would not serve Lady Porcupine. She would have to muster her armies from Colnaquar and the lands that lay south of it, all the way down to the thrice blessed fence that the mortals called Shadowline, and that the Quar themselves called Asish Yaritza, which meant storm of silence, or, with a slightly different intonation of voice or gesture of the hand, white thoughts. The northerners might not care about the mortal thieves, but those who lived below their icy lands did. As Yasamez rode, they came up from the cavern towns of Kirush Agat, First Deeps, and out from the forest villages in the great dark woods to see her pilgrimage. The starlight dancers paused and grew silent on the hilltops as she passed. Those who did not know her, for it had been long since Yasamez had last left her house at Shehen, knew only that one of the great powers was passing, terrible and beautiful as a comet. And although they feared and respected such might, they did not cheer her, but watched in troubled silence. Those of the Quar who did recognize her of old were fiercely divided, because they all knew that where Lady Porcupine went, she was blown on winds of war and blood. Some returned to their families or villages to tell them that bad weather was coming, that it was time to put away stores of what was needful and strengthen the walls and gates. Others followed her in a quiet but growing crowd, their numbers swelling behind her like a bride's train. All of these knew that the bridegroom to whom she went was death, and that her husband and master would not be careful of whom he took. But they followed her anyway. Centuries of anger and fear pushed them together, clenched them like a fist. Yasamez was the blade which that fist had raised in the past. Now it would be raised again. Her arrival threw Kulnaquar into confusion. By the time she rode through the great leaning gates at the head of a silent flock of Quar, the ancient citadel had already broken into camps of fanatical supporters and equally fanatical opponents, and a party larger than those two put together whose only shared philosophy was resistance to both extremes, a willingness to wait and see the shape that time took. But none of this was obvious, and to the casual eye, if there had been such a thing in this place, the great capital would have seemed to move in its usual deceptively calm way, its immemorial ordered disorder. The servitors of Yasames who waited for her within Kulnakwar, almost all of whom had been born into that service since the last time she had visited the city, had scurried to air out her chambers on the sprawling castle's eastern side, heaving up the shutters for the first time in decades and opening the windows. The chill marine winds and the ocean's ceaseless noise, like the breathing of a vast animal, filled the rooms as they rushed to make things ready for their mistress. This was a day that all knew would someday form a chapter of its own in the book of regret. But as she made her way through the hall of the gate, passing beneath its living sculptures without an upward glance, Yasames was surrounded not only by her own minions, but by all the dark city's excitement seekers as well. Those bright-eyed ones who dabbled in the showier magics, others who passed their time refining the arts of war and the arts of courtship until they were scarcely distinguishable from each other, all the planners of secret campaigns and delvers of forgotten mysteries. She was surrounded by believers, too, those who had yearned for a voice to echo forcefully their own talk of catastrophe, to satisfy their yearnings for an all-smothering doom. All came, singing and calling out questions, some in languages that even Yasames herself did not speak. She paid none of them any attention, and passed instead from the hall of the gate to the hall of black trees, then on through many more, the hall of silver bones, the hall of weeping children, the hall of gems and dust. She stopped outside the mirror hall, but did not go in, even though the blind king and silent queen waited behind the doors, aware of her coming since before she even left her high house. Instead, she told the servitor who guarded the entrance, a child of the emerald fire, who showed the faint glow of its kind even through its robe and mask, "Outside the gate there are thousands of our race who have followed me here from the countryside. See that they are well treated. Soon I will speak to them." The masked figure did not reply, but bowed. Yasames turned away from the mirror hall. It was not yet time to seal the pact of the glass, although that time would come before she left Kulnakwar again, and made her way to her old chambers overlooking the sea and the dark twilight sky. The crowd that had gathered inside the great castle and followed her through the halls like ants through a rotting tree were left to stand, to wait, to stare at each other in glee or shame or madness, and eventually to disperse. It did not matter. There would be a time for all of them, Yasames knew. She had donned her plate armor, forged in great deeps in the days before the book, cured for centuries in an ice mountain without a name. The black spikes covered it like the quills of her namesake, a dark bristling that was obscured but not hidden by her cloak, which seemed almost as insubstantial as a thundercloud. Her head was bare. She had set her featureless helmet on the table beside her, as though, like a favored pet, she wished it to watch the proceedings. 7 other figures sat at the round table in Lady Porcupine's chamber. It was dark in the room, only a single candle burning, its flame a-tremble before the open windows, but Yasames and her allies did not need to see each other. Some of what they said was spoken, Some passed only in shared thought. Eats the moon. What of the changing tribe? Many are with us. I smell anger. I smell readiness. Ours were often the first of the people to meet the stone apes, back in the world before defeat, and the first to suffer as well. Not all are fighters, but those who are not shall be ears and eyes for the rest, swift flyers, silent crawlers. Many. What number is that? A growl. Many. More than I can count. And Green Jay? What of the tricksters? Cautious, but willing to listen as you would expect. Our tribe always likes to determine which side will win, and then join that side at an opportune time. Not too late, but most definitely not too early. Your honesty is commendable. Can a frog be taught to fly? I tell you only what is true. There will be no winner in this fight, even if we triumph. This is only a moment in the great defeat. But the mortals will suffer, and our own suffering will become less. What the stone apes inherit when we are gone will no longer taste sweet to them, will never taste sweet again. Make no mistake, the time has come for your tricksters, and all the others too, to decide the manner of their passing, not as individuals, but as families of the people. But why, lady? Yes, why, lady? Why must we allow defeat? Still we are strong, and the old ways are strong. It is only resolve that has been weak. I have not yet come to you, Stone of the Unwilling. Soon I will ask you what the Guard of Elementals thinks. Ask me now. A pause. Speak. They think as I think, that we can retreat no farther, and that we can no longer live with exile and defeat. We must push them from our lands. We must put fire to all their houses and sickness in all their beds. We must shake down their temples and bury their cruel iron in the ground where it can become something clean again. We must bring on the old night. I have heard you, but no matter what they wish, will your tribe follow where I lead, whatever path I may choose, because only one can lead this thing. Can you lead, my lady? What of the pact? The pact of the glass will come to naught, an empty promise. But the old rules cannot be ignored, so I have agreed. It has been signed. Only an hour ago I put my blood on it. You signed the pact? Then they have given you the seal of war? For answer, she lifted her helmet from the table. In the dark room, the thing that had been hidden beneath it gleamed like molten stone. She lifted the red gem on its heavy black chain and put it on, let the stone fall with a dull clank onto her breast. Here it is. For a moment only the sound of the ocean was heard, the waves pounding against the rocks. The Guard of Elementals will follow you, Lady Yasames. The others spoke, one by one, telling her of their tribes, of their readiness or unreadiness, but all agreed there were enough to muster. There were enough to cross the line and make war. Then I have one more thing to show you. Yasames reached beneath her great cloak. Buckles clicked. A moment later she lifted her scabbard and dropped it on the table, then wrapped her hand around the hilt of the sword and pulled it out. From point to pommel it was as white as packed snow, as licked bone. The candle flame, taxed by one too many chill breezes, shuddered and died. The only light in the room now was the subtle, blindworm glow of the sword itself. I have taken Whitefire from its sheath. The voice of Yasames, the people's fire of vengeance, was matter of fact, whether aloud or in winged thought. Her words had weight because of who she was and what she said. It will not be sheathed once more until I am dead, or until what was taken from us is ours, and the Queen lives again. Bryony found him outside, to her surprise and annoyance, wandering in the quiet and somewhat gloomy west garden of the residence. Except he was not wandering. He was staring up at the roof line where the chimneys clustered like mushrooms that had sprouted after rain. Did you see that? Barrick rubbed his eyes. See what? I thought I saw. He shook his head. I thought I saw a boy on the roof. Is it the fever? I saw many things when I had the fever. She squinted, shook her head. Nobody would be up so high, certainly not a child. Why aren't you in bed? I came to see you and they told me you would refuse to stay in your chamber. Why? Because I wanted to see the sun, but it's almost gone. I feel like a corpse lying in that dark room. His face had closed again, the moment's vulnerability replaced by something harsher. It's not like you need me in any case. Bryony was shocked. What do you mean? Merciful Zoria Barrick, not need you? You're all I have left. Galen has just left the castle, left Southmarch entirely. He will be back in Summerfield in days, full of discontent, telling anyone who will listen about it. And many people will listen to the Duke of Summerfield. Her brother shrugged. So what can we do? Unless Galen's talking treason, we can't stop him saying what he wants. In fact, it wouldn't be easy to do even if he were talking treason. Summerfield Court has walls almost as thick as Southmarch, and the Tollies keep a small army there. It's too early to worry about things like that, and if the gods are kind or Galen has a shred of honor, we may not have to, but we have problems enough, Barrick. So no more of this nonsense, please. I need you to be well. Better a few days bored and restless in bed now than you being ill all through the winter months. Let Chavin tend you. No more of what nonsense? He shot her another of his suspicious glances. Are you certain you don't just want me out of the way so you can do something foolish? Pardon Shazo, perhaps? Her heart felt like a lump of lead. How could her twin, her beloved other half, think such things? Had the fever really changed him so much? No, no, Barrick. I would never do such a thing without your approval. He was staring at her, almost as if she were a stranger. Please, now is not the time for you and I to argue. We're all that's left of the family. There's still Marilana, and the loud mouse. Bryony grimaced. That's a strange thing, now you mention it. I have never seen Aunt Marilana so distracted. Perhaps over Kendrick, but it seems odd. She was strong as stone before the funeral, but has been grieving like a madwoman since, hardly leaving her chambers. I've been to see her twice, and she's barely spoken to me, as though she can't wait for me to leave. In fact, it seems that all the family we have left is at loose ends. Oh, and here's another surprise. Since you mentioned her, I should tell you that our stepmother has asked us to dine with her tomorrow night. What's that about? I don't know. But let's be open-hearted and believe she wishes to be closer to her stepchildren now that Kendrick is gone. Barrick's snort made his feelings clear. Another thing, have you seen the letter Father wrote? The one Kendrick received from Hyrosol the day before... Barrick shook his head. He looked annoyed. No, it was something more. He almost looked frightened. Why? No, he said. What does it say? That's just it. I don't know where it's gone. I can't find it. I don't have it, he said sharply, then waved his hand in weak apology. I'm sorry. I suppose I really am tired. I don't know anything about it. But it's important we find it. She looked at him, saw that it was no good pressing. He was exhausted. Whatever the case, never forget you are needed, Beric. I need you, desperately. Now, go to bed. Rest and let me do what needs to be done tomorrow. Then I'll tell you about it when we go to dine with Anissa. He looked at her, then looked around the garden. The sun had sunk behind the residence's western wing, and the roofs were rapidly becoming dark silhouettes. An entire army of fevered children could have been hiding there now. Very well, I will stay in my bed tomorrow, he said. But no longer. Good. Now I'll walk back with you. You see, I don't like sleeping, he told her as they made their way down the path. Almost without her noticing it, he had taken her hand, as he had done when they were both children. I don't like sleeping at all. I have such very bad dreams. All of our family being cursed, haunted. But that's all they are, Beric, dear Beric. Just dreams, fever dreams. But his words had started a chill in her, even as the first evening breezes swirled through the garden and made the leaves of the hedges and ornamental trees scrape and rustle. I dream that darkness is coming down, just like a storm, he said, almost whispering. Oh, Bryony, in my dreams, I see the end of the world. Chapter 15. The Seclusion. The brother's maiden daughter. She vanishes when we are all upright, appears when we lay ourselves down. Look, her crown is of gold and heather blossom. From the Bonefall Oracles. The seclusion, Quinneton quickly discovered, was not a building or even a group of buildings, but something vastly larger, a walled city within the autarch's immense palace. Sandstone brick buildings set in carefully husbanded grounds, most with shrines and scented gardens at their centers, all connected by hundreds of covered walkways that provided much needed shade, so that one of the seclusion's residents could travel from one side to the other, a journey that might take the best part of an hour without ever feeling the direct touch of the harsh Zandian sun on her skin. It truly was a city all by itself, home not just to the autarch's hundreds of wives, but to the army of people necessary to care for them. Thousands of maids, cooks, gardeners, and petty bureaucrats, and not a single one of them a man. None were men in the conventional sense, but there were certainly many hundreds of people within the seclusion's great high walls who had been born with at least the basic elements of masculinity, but who simply had not, for one reason or another, managed to hang on to all of them. The seclusion took up a sizable section of the autarch's gigantic orchard palace, just as the palace itself took up a large portion of Great Zis, mother of cities. In truth, the seclusion's share was proportionately larger than other sections of the ancient and monstrous sprawl of buildings, formerly known as the Palace of the Flowering Spring Orchard, because those who lived and worked in other parts of the great palace could share gardens and dining halls and kitchens, but the seclusion must be kept separate and protected, and so each function had to be carefully reproduced within its walls and staffed only with women or favored. If the seclusion was a small city, the favored were its priests and governors. Because of the famous sacrifice of Habili, son of Nushash, Zis had always been a kingdom in which the castrated were held in some esteem. It was almost as established a route to the corridors of power as the priesthood. In fact, the favored ruled not just the seclusion, but many of the bureaucracies of the Orchard Palace, so that the more daring soldiers of the autarch's army sometimes sourly joked, in private, of course, that real men weren't wanted in most of the palace, and would only be welcomed in the one place they were absolutely barred, the seclusion. The actual truth was that many ordinary men who still wore their stones held positions of influence throughout the autarch's court, like Penimin Vash, the paramount minister. The favored, as a group, were some of the autarch's mightiest subordinates, but they were by no means all-powerful. They had to struggle, as did everyone else in the Orchard Palace, for every fleck of attention from the god King Sulepus, from whom all power and glory radiated like the sun's light. But in the metaphorical darkness of the seclusion, that country of women, in which women held no nominal power, although the more important of the autarch's wives were powers unto themselves, the favored ruled virtually without rivals. The favored of the seclusion, perhaps in deference to a tradition no one could now remember, or perhaps for other, less exalted reasons, considered themselves women, not tremendously different from those over whom they watched, and made the traditional attributes of womanhood their own, although exaggerated into parody. They were almost all extremely excitable, romantic, vengeful, fickle. And, of course, the wives and their born female servants had their own complicated webs of influence and intrigue as well. Altogether, walking into the seclusion was like entering a magical cave out of a story, a place strung with invisible strands and snares, full of beautiful things, guarded by deadly traps. Quiniton's own role in the place was confusing from the first, and within days of entering she had begun to long for the certainty of her own life, of her old life, for her uncomplicated role as one of the youngest and thus lowest of the low among the Hive sisters. All the autarch's wives and wives-to-be, and it was hard to tell sometimes what the difference in status meant, since he so seldom visited any of them, were of infinitely greater importance than any of the seclusion's servants, and yet the 100th wife, let alone new-minted Quiniton, who was something closer to the 1,000th, had to wait weeks for even the briefest appointment to see Kuzi, the immensely fat chief of the seclusion's favored, the eunuch queen, as she was sometimes laughingly called in the Orchard Palace. But nobody in the seclusion would ever have laughed at old Kuzi to her face. Of all the denizens of that place, only Aramone, the autarch's paramount wife, a flinty, beautiful young woman known as the Evening Star, who was the autarch's cousin and had been the wife of the last older brother Sulepus had murdered to clear his path to the throne, would have stood up to Kuzi without a great deal of consideration. Since Aramone lived almost as removed from the seclusion as the autarch himself, she had her own little palace and grounds nestled at one end of the vast compound, like the innermost chamber of a nautilus, and no one, not even the other high-ranking wives, came there without an invitation. There was nobody to challenge the eunuch queen's authority. Quiniton had the fantastic luck, or so it seemed at the time, to be taken under the wing of Luyan, one of Kuzi's deputies, a motherly favored, at least in size and demeanor, since she was not particularly old, who took an unexpected interest in the new wife, and within days of Quiniton's arrival invited her to come to her chambers and drink tea. Quiniton was treated to the promised tea, along with powdered sania figs and several kinds of sweet breads, in a tented, cushion-strewn room in Luyan's chambers. The meal was accompanied by a gale of gossip and other useful information about the seclusion. But it was only at the end of the meal that Luyan explained why her eye had lit on Quinniton. "You don't recognize me, do you?" she said, as Quinniton bent to kiss her hand in farewell. Quinniton had been caught by the fact of Luyan's large hands, one of the few things now that betrayed her beginnings as a man, and so she did not for a moment understand the question. "Recognize you?" Quinniton said when the import finally sank in. "Yes, darling girl. You don't think I lavish my time on every little queen that comes through the door of the seclusion, do you?" Luyan patted her chest as if the idea gave her breathing problems. Her jewelry rattled. "My goodness, we've had 2 already this month from Crace, which is practically the moon. I was shocked to hear they even spoke a human language. No, my sweetness, I asked for you because we grew up in the same neighborhood." "Behind Cat's Eye Street?" "Yes, my darling. I remember you when you could barely walk, but I see you don't remember me." Quinniton shook her head. "I must admit I don't," favored Luyan. "Just Luyan, dear, please. But of course I was different then. Big and clumsy, studying to be a priest. You see, that's what I thought I would be until I was favored, and then I lost my taste for it. I even went to your father once for advice. I used to walk up and down the alleys between Cat's Eye and Feather Cape Row, reciting the 400 Nushash prayers, or trying to." Quinniton let go of Luyan's hand and stood up. "Oh, Dudon! You're Dudon! I remember you!" The favored waved her fingers languidly. "Shh! What, that name? That was years ago. I hate that name these days. Ungainly, unhappy creature. I am much more beautiful now, am I not?" She smiled as if to mock herself, but there was something other than self-mockery involved in the question. Quinniton looked at the person before her. It was a little harder to think of Luyan as female now, after the recollection of her former self. Discreetly examined the broad features, the thick makeup, the hands covered in rings, and said, "You are very beautiful now, of course." "Of course," Luyan laughed, pleased. "Yes, and you have learned your first lesson. Everyone in the seclusion is beautiful, wives and favored. Even if one of us should hold a knife to your throat and demand to be told she is looking poorly that day, just a little peaked around the eyes, perhaps, skin just a little less rosy than it should be, you will say only that you have never seen her more beautiful." For a moment, Luyan's kohl-rimmed eyes grew hard and shrewd. "Do you understand?" "But I meant it sincerely. And that is the second lesson. Say everything sincerely. Goodness, you are a clever girl. It is too bad that I will have so little to do with your training." "Why is that, Luyan?" "Because for some reason the Golden One has ordered that you must be schooled by Pan-Hisir's priests. But I will keep a close eye on you, and you will come to take tea with me often, if you would like." "Oh, yes, Luyan." Quinniton wasn't certain what she'd done to rate such attention, but she wasn't going to turn her back on it. Having a link to one of the favored, especially an important one like Luyan, could make a world of difference in one's accommodations, in the skill and tact of one's assigned servants, in any number of things up to and including the continuing favor of the autarch himself. "Yes, I would like that very much." She paused in the doorway. "But how did you know who I was? I mean, I would have been not much more than a baby when you left our old neighborhood. How could you recognize me?" Luyan smiled, settling back in her cushions. "I didn't. My cousin did." "Cousin?" "The chief of the leopards, the very, very handsome Jedin." Favored Luyan sighed in a way that suggested she had complicated feelings about this handsome cousin. "He recognized you." Suddenly, Quiniton, too, remembered the solemn-faced warrior. He recognized me? And you did not recognize him either, I see. Not surprising, I suppose. He has changed almost as much as I have. Would you remember if I called him Jin instead of Jedin? Little Jin? Quiniton put her hand to her mouth. Jin? I remember him. A bit older than me. He used to chase after my brother and his friends. But he was so small. Luyan chuckled deep in her throat. He grew. Oh my, he certainly did. And he recognized me? He thought he did, but he was not certain until he saw your parents. By the way, please write and tell your mother that she will be invited to visit you when the time is right, and to stop pestering us with pleading messages. Quiniton was embarrassed. I will, Luyan. I promise. She was still stunned by the idea that the slab-muscled leopard captain could possibly be little Jin, a perpetually wet-nosed boy whom her brothers had more than once smacked in the face and sent home crying. Jedin, looked now as though he could break any of Quiniton's brothers in half with one hand. I've kept you too long, Luyan, she said out loud. Thank you so much for your kindness. You are quite welcome, my darling. We cat's-eyed girls must stick together after all. The gardens are beautiful, said Dooney. And the flowers smell so lovely. Oh, Quiniton, you live in such a beautiful place. Quiniton drew her friend away from the climbing roses and toward a bench at the middle of the courtyard. Queen Sodan's garden was the largest in the seclusion, and its hedges were low, which was why she'd chosen it. I live in a very dangerous place, she told Dooney quietly when they sat down on the bench. I've been here 2 months, and this is the first conversation I've had where I won't have to worry whether the person I'm talking to might decide to have me poisoned if I say the wrong thing. Dooney's mouth fell open. No. Quiniton laughed in spite of herself. Yes. Oh, yes. My dearest Dunyaza, you just don't know. The meanness of the older sisters back at the hive, the way they get after the younger ones or the pretty ones, that was nothing. Here, if you're too pretty, they don't just push you down in the hallways or put dirt in your soup. If someone is jealous of you and you don't have a powerful protector, you end up dead. 5 people have died since I've been here. They always say they fell ill, but everyone knows better. Dooney looked at her sternly. You're teasing me, Kinya. I can't believe all that. These women have been chosen by the Autarch himself. He wouldn't allow anything to happen to them. Praise to his name. He scarcely ever comes, and there are hundreds of us anyway. I doubt he remembers more than a few. Most of the brides are chosen for political alliances. You know, important families in other countries, but some of them are like me. Nobody knows why they've been chosen. We know why you were chosen. Because he fell in love with you. Quiniton snorted. Ugh, I thought I asked you not to make up stories about me, Dooney. Fell in love with me? He scarcely noticed me, even when he was making the arrangements with my parents, such as they were. She made a sour face. Not that they could have said no, I suppose, but they sold me. To the Autarch? That is not being sold. That is a great honor. Dooney's face suddenly froze. Won't you be in trouble for saying such things? She whispered. Now you know why I brought you out here, where there are no walls or high hedges for spies to hide behind. Quiniton felt as though she had aged 10 years since leaving the hive, felt very much the older sister now. Do you see that gardener over there, over by that pavilion? Him in the baggy clothes? Yes, but not a him. And the gods save you if you ever said that in front of her. That's Tanisa, one of the favored. Most of them go by women's names here. Anyway, it's her job to watch me, although I don't know who's given the job to her. Everywhere I go, there she is. For a gardener, she seems to travel from one part of the seclusion to another very freely. She was in the baths yesterday morning, pretending to have some errand with the young favored boy who heats the water. Quinniton looked at the well-muscled gardener with distaste, as Tanisa pretended to examine the leaves of a monkey fruit tree. They say she killed that young Acarisian princess who died last month. Threw her out of a window. But of course they say she fell. But Quinn, that's terrible. She shrugged. It's how things are here. I have some friends, too. Not friends like you and I are friends, of course, although I may make some of those too someday. The kind of friends you have to have if you want to stay alive, if you don't want to fall over dead after drinking your tea or some evening. Dooney looked at her without saying anything for a long time. A long time for Dooney, anyway. You seem different, Quinniton. You seem hard, like one of those traveler girls that dance in Sun's Progress Square. Quinniton's laugh was a little harsh, but something about Dooney's innocence made her angry. It was the fact that Dooney could still afford to be innocent more than anything else. Well, I probably am. Everyone talks nicely here. Oh, they do talk nicely. And other than the occasional hissing catfight, everything is quite peaceful and comfortable. Do you like my dress? She lifted her arm and let the pleated sleeve fall, graceful and translucent as a dragonfly's wing. It's lovely. Yes, it is. As I said, everything is quite peaceful and comfortable on the surface. But underneath it is a pit full of scorpions. Don't talk like that, Quinn. You're scaring me. Dooney took her hand. You're a queen. That must be wonderful, even if the people here are tiresome. What is the autarch like? Did you... She colored. Quinniton could not resist rolling her eyes. After all, it was a self-indulgence she could not allow herself most of the time. Dooney, don't you listen? I already told you the autarch almost never comes here. When he wants to see one of his wives, he has her brought to his palace. Well, I suppose this is all his palace, but you know what I mean. He has never spoken to me since he brought me from my parents, let alone made love to me. So, yes, since you are wondering, I am still a virgin. As you may remember from listening to the older girls, in most cases, a deflowerment requires the man and the woman to be in the same room. Kunya, you shouldn't talk like that, Dooney said, but whether because she was embarrassed or because she did not want to suffer further damage to her flowery illusions wasn't clear. After a moment, she asked, But if he didn't fall in love with you, and you're not a princess of somewhere, you're not, are you? Then why did he marry you? First off, he hasn't married me yet, Quinniton told her. At least I don't think so. I've had some religious instruction from the priests, some very strange rituals. So maybe that's why, to prepare me for the marriage ceremony. Some of the women here went through ceremonies, but some others were, well, just taken. But as to why he chose me, well, Dooney, I don't know. And nobody else in this poisonous place seems to know quite why either. I have such a nice treat for you, darling, Luyan announced when Quinniton arrived, a little breathless in the favored's chambers. We must primp and prepare, both of us. We don't have much time. She snapped her fingers, and her pair of silent Tuani slave women came into the room like shadows. But, Luyan, thank you. What are we? We are going to the palace, my sweet. Out of the seclusion. Yes, Someone very special wants to see you." For a moment Quiniton found it hard to breathe. The autarch? Oh, no! Luyan threw up her hands and laughed. The Tuani girl with the curling iron, who had come within an eyelash of burning her mistress on the arm, paled a little. "Oh, no! If it was the autarch himself, they'd be preparing you for days. No, we are going to see my cousin." It took a moment for Quiniton to understand. "Jedin? Of the leopards?" "Yes, my dearest. We are invited to see handsome Jedin. He wishes to speak with you, to hear stories of the old neighborhood. I am going along as chaperone, lucky girl that I am. I do so admire that young man. But, am I allowed to meet with any men at all?" A look of annoyance creased Luyan's powdered forehead. "He is not any man. He is a chief of the leopards, chosen by our autarch himself. Praise to his name. Besides, I will be with you, child. I told you, if that is not respectable, what is?" But the favored's eyes darted briefly to the Tuani slave beside her, and Quiniton could not help wondering if it was all truly as obvious and ordinary as Luyan made it out to be. When they were both ready, favored Luyan rigged like a festival ship in a fringed and beaded robe, and Quiniton in a less ostentatious and properly virginal white robe with a hood, different only in quality from something she might have worn in a hive procession, they set out. Despite her misgivings, Quiniton could not help being excited. It was the first time in 3 months she had been outside of the seclusion's walls, even if it was only to another part of the great orchard palace. Other than Dooney, and Quiniton's mother, who had spent most of her visit weeping over their family's good fortune, this would be her first chance to see anyone from outside. And, needless to say, Jedin would be the first natural man she had seen since he and his soldiers had brought her here, to this invincible prison of beautiful blossoms, splashing fountains, and cool stone arcades. The favored who guarded the seclusion's outer gate did not dress a bit like women. They were the largest people Quiniton had ever seen, a half-dozen hulking creatures with ceremonial swords whose flat, curved blades were almost wide enough to use as tea trays. They engaged in a long, whispered discussion among themselves. Before Luyan, Quiniton, and the 2 silent Tuani servants were at last allowed to pass out of the seclusion and into the greater palace, but only with one of the guards bringing up the rear of the small procession, like an enormous dog guiding a herd of sheep. The little company continued on for a good portion of an hour, through lush but empty gardens and unused corridors and courtyards so opulent that they seemed to have been prepared for some royal princeling who had not yet moved into them. At last they reached a small but prettily decorated courtyard that rang with the sounds of a fountain. At one edge of court, where the tiles gave way to a pocket garden, with paths of pale sand, a muscular, sun-browned young man sat on mounds of cushions beneath a striped awning big enough for a dozen guests. As if he were the groom to Quiniton's bride, he too wore a robe of flowing white. He stood as they approached, hesitated a moment between Quiniton and Luyan, between nominal rank and actual power, and then lowered himself to one knee before the girl. "Mistress, so kind of you to come." He rose and turned to Luyan. "Respected cousin, you do me honor." Luyan produced a fan from her sleeve and snapped it open with a clack like an eagle taking wing. "Always a pleasure, Captain." Jedin beckoned his visitors to join him beneath the awning, then sent his servant to fetch refreshments. By the way, just to pause for just a moment, I'm going to finish this chapter, which is a couple of more pages, so I'll go a little bit past the top of the hour, but not much more than that. Jedin beckoned his visitors to join him beneath the awning, then sent his servant to fetch refreshments. After an appropriate time of small talk with Luyan about her health, and the health of various important residents of the seclusion, he turned to Quiniton. Luyan says you remember me now. She blushed, since many of her chief memories were of him being humiliated by older boys. It was even harder to reconcile that with the present, now that she saw him again. The leopard captain's muscles moved under his dark skin like those of a real leopard she had once seen in a cage in the Sun's Progress marketplace, the most fearsome animal she had ever encountered. For all its strength, though, despite its dreadful teeth and claws, that leopard had seemed sad to her and not altogether present, as though it saw not the crowds of people around it, but the shadow-splashed woodlands where it had once roamed. Saw those places, but knew it could not reach them. Oddly, she thought she saw something of this in Jedin's eyes as well, but knew she must simply be romanticizing, muddling this handsome young man with that trapped beast. Yes, Captain, I do remember you. You knew my brothers. I did. Like an eminent man asked to recall the pivotal moments of his career, Jedin began to reminisce at length about the days in Cat's Eye Street, describing the adventures of a group of young scapegraces, of whom he felt compelled to admit he had not been the least mischievous. To hear him speak, he had been one among equals, and none of the miseries she recalled on his behalf had ever truly happened. It was strange, as though he had lived his childhood on the other side of an ornamental screen from the rest of them, making up his own mind what things meant, seeing only what he wished to see. Several times Quiniton had to bite her tongue when the urge to correct him became strong. There was something about Jedin, the way he talked, that made her feel as though telling him now that even a small part of his memory was faulty would be no different than the way her brothers had sometimes pushed him from behind as he ran, making him go so much faster than his legs could carry him that he stumbled and fell. The refreshments came, and as the servants poured tea and piled sweetmeats on plates, Quiniton watched Luyan watching Jedin, which the favored did with a sort of avidity she usually reserved for things like the rosewater jelly being spooned into her bowl. It seemed unusual, not that Luyan should find Jedin attractive. He was more than that, his body as hard and wonderfully defined as a statue, his face befittingly serious and noble of cast, with nose straight and strong, and eyes a surprisingly bright green under the heavy brows. But that someone like Luyan, who in all other ways seemed to have settled into a kind of premature, matronly old age, and who, after all, had given up her original organs years ago, should still have such feelings at all. Well, said Luyan abruptly, ending a silence, to think that after so many years we of the old neighborhood should have a reunion here. The captain's emerald eyes now turned to Quiniton. You must be very happy, mistress. Of all of us, well as we have done, you have risen highest. A wife of the Golden One himself. He dropped his gaze. An unmatched honor. Yes, of course. Although I might as well be married to a hassock or a sandal for all that comes of it, she almost said, but didn't. Jedin had the look of a religious man, and obviously he must be devout at least where the autarch himself was concerned. I am blessed by his notice. And he is blessed by... He paused, and to her amazement appeared to blush. And he, our autarch, is blessed by all the heavens, and especially by his heavenly father Nushash, said Luyan abruptly and loudly. Yes, of course. All praise to the Golden One, said Jedin. Quiniton echoed the blessing, but could not help feeling something important had just happened, and she had missed it. We should go now, cousin. Luyan waved for the Tuani girls to help her to her feet, which they did, fighting the favorite's great weight like nomads trying to put up a tent in a high wind. Thank you for the refreshments and the courtesy of your company. There was a new tone in Luyan's voice, faintly cold. Jedin scrambled to his feet. Of course, respected cousin, You grace us with your presence." He bowed to her, then to his other guest. He did it with some grace, but that didn't surprise Quiniton. She imagined that even for a soldier, bowing well must be almost as important in the Autarch's court as handling a sword or gun. "I wish you could stay longer." "Propriety forbids it," said Luyan shortly, setting sail for the door with her servants and Quiniton fluttering in her wake like gulls. The huge favored guard fell in behind them in the corridor, mute and sleepy-eyed. Did I do something wrong, Luyan?" Quiniton asked after they had walked for some distance in silence and were nearing the gate to the seclusion. Luyan only waved her hand, whether because of discretion or irritation was hard to say. When they had left the immense guard behind and were back within the walls, Luyan leaned toward her and said in a harsh whisper that might or might not have been too quiet for the Tuani servants to hear, "You must be careful, and Jadin must not be a fool." "What do you mean? Why are you angry with me?" Luyan frowned. The paint on her lips had begun to smear a little into her face powder, and for the first time she appeared grotesque to Quiniton and even a little frightening. "I'm not angry with you, although I will remind you that you are no longer a low-caste girl in the alleys behind Feathercape Row. You have been given great honors, but you live in a dangerous world." "I don't understand." "Oh? You couldn't see what I could see as clearly as my own hand at the end of my arm? That man is in love with you." Even in her astonishment, Quiniton could not help thinking that the anguish on Luyan's face seemed less like that of a guardian unheeded than a lover scorned. And that's where we're going to stop. So, thank you so much for your time and attention. It was deuced kind of you. And now I am going to go trotting off and see what's left over from dinner. Because I never eat before I read these things, because it's already bad enough when you start coughing. But if you start coughing and burping, well, nobody likes to see that. Well, maybe the people who used to watch, some of those MTV shows like Jackass would enjoy that. But I'm sure my refined readers would not, and my refined listeners would not like such things. Anyway, so, yeah, that's it. We're done. I will be back next Sunday at 2 a.m. on this same channel and all these same channels. And then again at this slot, which is the 7 p.m. slot on Sundays. And I hope you will join me then. It is such a great pleasure to see you. And I look forward to doing it again really, really soon. So y'all be good to yourselves. Be good to the people around you. Continue to move forward. Enjoy. And I will enjoy seeing you again soon. Ciao.